Hello and welcome to Youth Forum on Foreign Policy's interview series. Today we have with us a very distinguished guest, Senior Fellow from Brookings India, Dr. Y. Singh Sidhu. Dr. Sidhu, how are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with both of you.
Oh, very well. Same here, Dr. Sidhu. So we'll just be putting certain questions on contemporary politics to Dr. Sidhu. Mitika, you can go ahead.
Hello, sir. My first question is, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi applauded the significance of social media in international relations during his recent trip to America. Do you think that Twitter diplomacy and Facebook's town hall session are the new enhancement tools for developing foreign relations with other countries?
It's a very good question. I would say that they're probably not necessarily dramatically new. But I think there are new elements in trying to conduct foreign policy, because foreign policy, a lot of it is also going to be behind the scenes, is also going to be very much person to person. But there is no doubt that in today's interconnected world, in today's globalized world, that there's much more awareness of civil society, of groups like yours in every country. About foreign policy. And so there's a very direct need to engage and interact with the youth, with civil society. And to that extent, these social media tools are critical. I don't think any country can now afford to not have these. I would not be surprised that even if North Korea, perhaps one of the most isolated countries, also has a Twitter account.
Exactly.
So you're pushing forward to the idea of a global village through maybe social media.
That's true. Absolutely, that's true. That in many ways, the world is becoming a global village. But let's not forget that diplomacy is still conducted by diplomats. Foreign policy is still very much the remit of states. It's true that it's not only the remit of states alone anymore. There are more actors, and that certainly has to be taken into account, and that's a key element why social media is important. But I wouldn't say that social media has so dramatically changed, the sort of the outlook of foreign policy formulation.
So just taking this same strand of thought and just revealing a more pessimistic side of social media. Last year we saw an arrest from Bangalore where a person was handling the Twitter account of ISIS. So my question is, does India face any credible threat from groups like ISIS who are significantly hidden in India, which I presume, considering the recent crackdown on social pages of Indian youths and their subsequent arrests?
Well, so there are two sets of questions here.
Exactly.
One on the notion of social media, and then the other on the ISIS. So maybe I'll address them like that. On social media, quite clearly, the one thing about it, the positive thing is, it's very democratic. The negative thing is that it can be used by anyone and abused by everyone, just like democracies in many ways. And that's one of the challenges as to how you address that. Also, because social media occasionally sometimes also tend to be closed circles, you can see that groups may well then be using it only to propagate a particular sort of idea and only within a certain set of groups. And the ISIS is a very good example of that, right? Where they're able to use a closed group and propagate those ideas within. Now, of course, others can visit, etc., and that's that's an important element there as well. So clearly, social media has become very important for groups like ISIS, and that, along with the traditional threats that groups like ISIS pose, is a threat to India, is a new threat to India. But let's again put this in perspective, right? It's interesting, by all accounts today, the number of Indians reportedly involved in ISIS, both here and in the countries where ISIS is active, is about 100. That's an estimate. Now, if you look at the size of India's population, that is not that significant. And particularly when you contrast it with the fact that Australia, Australia, which has a population much smaller than India's, maybe about 16 to 20 million, also has 100.
Okay.
So it just puts you into context as to what kind of a threat that ISIS poses. Now, there are two kinds of threats that ISIS poses. One is, as you said, hidden within the country.
Exactly.
People who are joining it. Others, it's a threat to Indians who are working in the Gulf regions. Particularly in the Gulf, as you know, there are anything between 6 to 7 million Indians who are working there. And until now, even though, the region has seen wars and conflicts between Iran and Iraq, between the US and Iraq, not once but twice, Indians have not been touched, by and large. There have been one or two instances, but not significantly. But ISIS is very deliberately also targeting India.
Yes.
And that is a very direct threat as well.
Yes.
This is with reference to the captives of the Indian professors back in these regions, and also about the nurses captives.
Precisely.
Which turned the foreign policy back here in India.
Absolutely, and as you recall, India's response was reactive, and it was to basically try and evacuate Indians based in Iraq, Kuwait, and then now more recently
we have
Yemen.
seen a very proactive foreign policy from the Indians.
Yeah.
Yes. For the past few months, we've seen Europe has been suffering from the migrant crisis. Similarly, India has also been suffering with the refugee crisis back in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. What are the lessons that India can learn from Europe's fallout of, say, humanitarian crisis or migrant crisis? And can you put any reference or a perspective to the floating coffins idea back here in South Asia? Because not much has been written on it. Basically, more also because the media has played a very small role in it. So what are your thoughts on it?
Two elements, I think, on the migrant stroke refugee issue, and this is, of course, itself contentious whether they're migrants or whether they're refugees.
Exactly.
And that needs to be sort of clarified a little bit as well. I think there are two ways that countries try to address the refugee issue and the migrant issue. And of course the two are different, but there's some common sort of approaches to them. One is to try and accommodate refugees, absorb them, make sure that they're given adequate amount of security and stability, etc. When they come over, because refugees are perhaps the most vulnerable of any group that you can think of anywhere in the world, right? But on the other hand, this is probably the short-term approach. The long-term approach is that you really try and resolve issues in the home country. Try and address root causes so that the situation changes significantly for the refugees to go back, right? I think in many ways Europe has tried both and has relatively failed, in both. Partly on the first one, and that's all been in the news, but on the second one, in terms of root causes, they really have not had the staying power. They have not stayed on long enough to try and sort of address that. Now, in the case of India actually has a very good story to tell on refugees. India has actually accepted many, many more refugees than many of the neighboring countries, for example, or even other countries, in other parts of the world. The problem is India has not signed up to the Refugee Convention. Because it's very cautious about not wanting to be tied down and then being told, right, you have to take refugees.
Exactly.
India has taken refugees but is reluctant to have that enforced upon it. So it's a strange situation, because I actually think India has a very good news story to tell and should tell it and should not hesitate about going forward on that. But unfortunately, it hasn't done so.
Yeah. So something which also has been in the news right in the past is India's fallout in its relations with Nepal. While it was being said as the big brother of Nepal, what we have seen is that the relations have turned sour in the context of the secularism debate, constitution drafting, and excluding the rights and privileges of the Madhesis community in Nepal. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, certainly, I think the way that India and Nepal relations have taken a nosedive is actually really quite unfortunate, given that particularly for this government, that was one of the early success stories of its foreign policy. And there I think, I'm sure there is blame to be apportioned on both sides. But there's no doubt that there was probably an opportunity for quiet diplomacy earlier in the year. It's not quite clear why India did not take it up at that point in time, when it was quite clear where the constitution was heading. And part of this may well have to do with the capacity or lack of it of India, in trying to sort of engage effectively the neighbors. And I think this has been one of the perhaps unfortunate fallouts of that. And the subsequent response of India, has clearly may not have been as appropriate or as adequate. But on the other hand, I think Nepal is very much in its own right to determine what it does with its constitution.
And just counter questioning on the previous one, don't you think China played a more important role in turning India-Nepal relations more sour in the recent time? Because when India refused to provide essential commodities to Nepal at crisis time, it was China that airlifted oil and other commodities. So I think China is the big elephant here, which is basically responsible for deteriorating relations between India and Nepal.
Well, I mean, I think there's two ways of looking at it, so that would certainly be the Indian perspective, and that's fair, and that's fine, that's fine. But if you're a Nepalese, right, you're desperate, winter is coming, you need oil and gas, and you're going to turn to countries that are going to support you, right? So I think maybe, yes, we all know the tradition of carrots and sticks, but in some ways you also need to calibrate that, because if you push any country much too much into a corner, it will try to look for alternatives. And, that's clearly what has happened in the case of Nepal. Now, it happens to be that China is there, but, what would you have done if it would have been some other countries? And there may have been possibly other countries which may be willing to step in as well. So I think, again, I would probably argue that, there's enough blame to be apportioned on both sides.
Both sides.
That side. Yeah.
The recent trend in international relations affirms the idea that foreign policy is all about acquiring membership in elite organizations. Why has the media gone frenzy with India having a slightest chance of getting a permanent seat in United Nations Security Council? What are the implications?
Well, I mean, this is the big crown, right? I mean, it's the one that everybody has been aspiring for, because the idea very much is that if you look globally, right, there is one institution which very much determines peace and security issues.
Exactly.
And increasingly, they're also starting to now talk and determine outcomes in other issues, on social issues, on economic issues, on human rights issues, on climate, etc. It's an expanding portfolio. And if that is where a lot of these initiatives are going to be taken, then countries which have very key stakes in these emerging norms and institutions also need to be represented there. And I think that's the reason why there is a growing recognition that if the UN Security Council in particular is going to play such a proactive and, dare I say, legislative role, then India wants to be in on legislating. And that, I think, is the reason why that India is quite determined and quite keen to move there as well. But there are huge challenges. One of the challenges is how India has approached this issue. Sometimes it's doing it individually, sometimes it's doing it as a part of the G4. And there's a little bit of a disconnect in the sense of how one fits with the other, and perhaps the Indian narrative needs to be clearer. But the second is how other countries are looking at reforms of the Security Council. They may be, and India needs to also feed into that narrative and make it, make make India's case appealing to all those other countries as well. And here I think, the continent of Africa is a very important and good example of how that narrative needs to be conveyed in a way that is appealing to the Africans as well. So the third India-Africa, Forum Summit, I think is really critical for four areas or four reasons, right? So one of them is historical. Both of these, this continent and India had a very common kind of, colonial and decolonization experience. And that has led to some common norms and understandings of sovereignty, protection of borders, rule of law, constitutional structures, etc., etc. So there's quite a bit of commonality in terms of how they look at it, what you might call soft power, right? So that's one area where they're all sort of looking together, and it's no coincidence that all the African countries are members of the non-aligned movement, except one, South Sudan, which is a recent country in that sense. And India, as you know, was a leading member of NAM and founder member, etc., etc. So that's one element. The second element is economics, right? Where it's really becoming quite crucial for India's economic development to tap into the abundant and rich resources in Africa, particularly oil and natural gas. Now with all the issues we talked about in the Middle East, with ISIS, etc., India needs to diversify. And African oil and gas resources have been underutilized but also underexplored. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And that's only oil and gas. There's all kinds of other minerals, uranium, for example, from Niger, and a whole variety of
abundant
other
resources,
stuff. So that's another key element. But also, as the Indian economy grows, there's going to be markets in Africa, which are going to be crucial for India. So India, and already the private sector is actually quite active, particularly in automobiles, in the IT sector, in infrastructure, telecommunication in particular, is really quite crucial. So that's the second sort of element, right? The third element is, what is the one that you're talking about, right? Which is the global governance structure.
Exactly.
Now, in the global governance structure, there are two elements. One is reform of existing structures, like the UN Security Council, right? But equally important, India and Africa need to work together on new structures which has still not been created. For example, for climate. For food security. For energy security, there are no global structures. Those are the kind of things that these two can partner together and work. And that's an important sort of area that they need to work on. And last but not the least, the fourth element is security. That's also where it's become very, very crucial for India now. There are security threats to Africa. And within Africa, for example, the largest number of peacekeepers, that India has anywhere in the world are in Africa. And that's for peace and security issues, right? And we have we have terrorism right from Boko Haram, all the way to the Somali pirates. So right across, you've got all kinds of challenges, many of which are spilling over into India. So that poses a challenge and threat. So I would say that the India-Africa Summit was much wider and broader, but certainly one key element was reform of existing governance structures, global governance structures.
Since you spoke about environmental issues, my next question is, to resolve the growing environmental concerns, the northern countries have prepared a new list of commandments for the south, that is control of pollution index, carbon emissions, or imposing green tax, which very recently the Delhi state has decided to do. Do you think the upcoming Paris summit on environment can be a major breakthrough for Kyoto Protocol and an advancement over Rio de Janeiro talks?
Well, I think it's going to set some interesting norms. Because what it's basically done is all the countries have voluntarily offered their national determined kind of quotas, right? And I think that's going to be the contribution of Paris, right? But I think the debate on how they achieve those national quotas is really going to be open for debate, and that's going to be a lot of horse trading, as it should be. And there's going to be a lot of, if you like, pressure from the global north. But I think you're also going to find a lot of pushback from the global south. Many of the countries which, like India, want to make sure that it is going to keep on a certain development trajectory, but is equally concerned about environmental damage and risk. You see that time and time again, sitting as we are in New Delhi, and you can see, the impact of it and the way that we're affecting, forests. Yeah, exactly. Or even the field burning. And then you see that is a direct sort of impact. So I think Paris, in that sense, is an important step, but it's not the end of the road.
Exactly.
To the north and south debate.
So I guess any dialogue, any interview cannot go without Pakistan being talked about. And I'll just, we had a delegation from India, a certain member of parliament, including our founder, Gaurav Gogoi. They went to the United States, and one of the key issues which they raised was the US aid to Pakistan. And that Pakistan spends most of the aid on stockpiling of nuclear arsenals for security concerns. It says for security concerns and sovereignty threats. So should India be perturbed with Pakistan's hasty decision on defense expenditure in the context of nuclear deterrence and no first use?
Well, so again, two sets of questions there. So one on the narrow one of, Pakistan's expenditure on its defense capabilities, okay? And the other is the broader question vis-a-vis
the nuclear deterrence.
Yeah, or even India-Pakistan relations, right? Now, again, I think it is nationally determined. Countries make their own decisions as to how much they want to spend in defense, right? That remains an internal political, economic interaction and process, right? Pakistan has made such a determination, okay? And it is going to spend to the extent that it feels is necessary. Now, there are several possible repercussions of that. And I'm going to talk initially about Pakistan and then, outside of Pakistan. One is that Pakistan continues to grow and is able to spend that much, and, that's one option. The other is that Pakistan overspends and collapses.
Exactly.
And we've seen this in other cases. We've seen this classically in the case of the Soviet Union. So it depends, and in that case, the question will be how much will countries like the United States or others be willing to keep propping up Pakistan? At what cost will that sort of carry on? Now, how do countries around Pakistan, and in this particular case, India, respond and react to that, right? Again, you've got two sort of distinct approaches. One is, if you look at the Cold War context, the superpower context, the bipolar context, US and USSR, the US outspent the Soviets, right?
Exactly.
Because they could. They had a bigger economy, and they went about doing that. And I think that is certainly one approach that India could think about, where they have a bigger economy, and it says, look, we can outspend them, let's outspend them. We won't go broke, okay? The other approach is in some ways the US-China approach, right? Where the Chinese have been much more frugal, have been much more considerate as the amount they're spending on nuclear deterrence, right? They feel what they have is adequate to deter the United States. They don't feel the need to match the United States dollar for dollar, okay? So that's another approach. And that's probably an approach that India is also, the sense is that India is probably going to use both of these approaches. So India is going to spend what is comfortable to it, because it can, It's not dependent on aid or funding from others. It's going to do that. But I think at the same time, India would not want to match dollar for dollar with Pakistan. Not at all. Because in many ways, India's deterrence calculations go well beyond Pakistan, as we know. So that's what is going to be the primary driver for India. In which case, Pakistan is one element in that, but not the only element.
Okay, so before I move on to Mithika for the last question, just adding a bit to that, United States comes out with a perspective that it's putting in foreign aid to Pakistan because it perceives a threat from the non-state actors in Pakistan who can acquire the nuclear power that Pakistan is creating.
Right.
So just so that those non-state actors don't get a hand on that nuclear power, United States of America is pushing in funds so as to increase the security of those of the nuclear aids in Pakistan.
Right.
Do you think there's any sense to that?
Well, look, that is one approach, right? And I think since we're talking about nuclear, let's make one thing very clear. It's quite interesting. There is a threshold, right? And there's a very clear, Rubicon between not being nuclear and being nuclear. Okay, if a country is not nuclear, they have also witnessed the use of force. Forcibly being disarmed.
Okay.
Iraq is a very good example of that. To some extent, Libya is also an example of that. Iran is an example, but in a different way. That force is not being used yet or now, and maybe it won't be used if the agreement goes forward. But we've also seen that once a country crosses the nuclear Rubicon, like North Korea did,
it's trying to do,
or North Korea has done, is a nuclear weapon state. There's greater hesitation in the US taking action. The same is true vis-a-vis Pakistan.
Exactly.
Okay, because one could have argued that one way to make sure that nuclear weapons do not fall into the hands of armed non-state actors is to take away those nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
Right, but the United States is not doing that.
It's trying to diffuse this.
It's trying to diffuse it because there's once a country acquires nuclear weapons, the dynamics change very dramatically, and you then have to contend with this new reality.
Exactly.
And my final question is, how do you analyze Narendra Modi's foreign policy in the context of Digital India campaigns, begging for Make in India projects across the world, and very recently the Chota Rajan arrest and possibly the UNSC seat? So from the period of 2014 till 2015, what are your comments, hopefully the critical ones, on Narendra Modi's foreign policy? And is there any continuity and change in India's foreign policy?
Again, I think it's a good question to end on, because I think there is significant continuity between the foreign policy of Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the previous governments. Okay, and that is for a very simple reason. The reason is that India has two objectives. Okay, number one, it wants to become the world's third largest economy. It doesn't want to become the world's third largest economy, but it wants to have economic development.
Exactly.
And in that process, it will become the world's third largest economy. Okay, but at the same time, it also wants to be a very key player in the multilateral world in developing these new norms and institutions which are still in the process of being developed, like climate change that we talked about. And that's a continuity. Every government since 1991 has been talking about that, has been moving in that direction in very many ways. Okay. However, the changes and even the approach, before I get to the change, even the approach of how you want to do that, you need to work with other countries, etc., is also the same. Okay. Similarly, the other continuity is you also want to have a no-war scenario. Okay. The previous government, for example, after the attack in Mumbai in 2008, many would have thought India would have been justified in going to war.
Exactly.
But India did not, because the idea was very much to try and see and keep a no-war scenario as far as possible, unless you're absolutely pushed to the wall. Okay. And that's another continuity. Even this government wants to make sure and preserve that no war scenario, make sure that it doesn't, go in that sort of direction. Okay, so that's tremendous continuity on the economic front, on the no war front, on focusing on the neighborhood, ensuring peace and security in the neighborhood. Okay, the significant change is in the approach. Okay, and some of those that you've listed are key elements of that, right? What you're seeing is a much more greater emphasis on a much more dynamic approach, a much more engaged sort of approach, an effort to be much more proactive. Right? These are all the words that we hear linked up with particularly Prime Minister Modi. And it's true, he has been much more proactive in the first year than say compared to the other government. However, and this is where again it comes back to, even though there are dramatic changes, there might actually be more continuity than change. There are major limitations in capacity. Okay,
Yes.
And there are three limitations in capacity, and I think I'll end with that. Number one, the size of the Foreign Service. It still remains dramatically small. Okay, just to give you one example, you talked about India-Africa. We discussed that. Over 24 African countries do not have an ambassador or a high commissioner from India. Okay, why are they missing? So, it's such a small service that it has to prioritize, obviously, and that is starting to show. So a prime minister can go and make initiatives and great declarations, but if you don't have the capacity to follow it up,
Exactly.
it's going to not go very far. So that's number one. Number two, until now, there was really not very clear thinking in terms of policy planning as to what India's foreign policy should look like. What is the grand strategy? Okay, this was a missing gap. Now, this government has certainly initiated that process. The policy planning unit has really been empowered, and they're trying to do more and engage much more. But it still is early days. We need to see how that goes forward. And the third and another major, perhaps one of the biggest limitations is the center-state conflict. Okay, we saw this in the previous government, and we've also seen it in this government. Now, this government, to its credit, has tried to reach out and do something about it, right? There's now actually a new unit being set up to engage with states. But again, it's one thing to make those announcements, it's one thing to set up that capability, but you need to do much more to deliver.
Exactly.
Even the new setup which they've named is cooperative competitive federalism.
That's right.
That's the thing as well.
Exactly, and it poses a challenge.
Yes.
So I would say that there's lots of, in fact, this is the title of the essay that we wrote at the end of Prime Minister Modi's first year. Bold initiatives, sort of basically stymied by systematic weaknesses.
Yes.
And so, you can have a prime minister who can be very proactive, as he is, but unless you can back it up with a systemic change in approach, it's not going to deliver or be able to deliver.
Exactly. So thank you so much, Dr. WPS Sidhu, for that wonderful engagement.
Thank you.
I hope our subscribers like it. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more such interviews. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much for your questions. Excellent. Thank you.